When I hear the First Amendment used as a reason to keep traditional moral values away from policymaking, I'm shocked. The First Amendment was written not to protect the people and their laws from religious values, but to protect those values from government tyranny.
Ultimately, of course, you have such remedies as amending the Constitution to overturn court decisions that are particularly unacceptable to the body politic generally.
Why won't they let the Christian students and parents just do what they want to do, since they're not really hurting anybody, right?
That's right. Why
I think the reason is because it's warfare. It's a condition of irreconcilable hostility between two views of reality.
I'm Bruce Page, and in this program, we'll reveal what has become a distinct trend in Supreme Court decisions, and we'll tell you the significant effects they have on your life and that of your family. We'll take you back 200 years to clarify what our founding fathers intended when they drafted the Bill of Rights and took care to make special provision for our religious freedoms. We'll compare notes and point out how the High Court justices have strayed further and further away from the Constitution makers. Reports from around the country are now flashing a warning that the foundation and therefore the future of religious liberty are in serious danger. One such warning could be heard in Kansas City at the University of Missouri, where religious speech has now been prohibited.
The protest rallies and student marches of the 1960s firmly established the freedom of speech that university campuses have fought for since their inception. But now, that same right is being questioned on the basis of religious grounds. It all started with a university regulation that's been on the books since 1972. At that time, the Board of Curators ruled that no university buildings or grounds could be used for religious worship or religious teaching. Student groups were free to meet on campus, but never for those purposes. Well, that regulation was on the books for 5 years, but it never was actively enforced until 1977, when the Dean of Students said it was being violated by a group called Cornerstone.
And I'm just thinking, here I am training, you know.
We tried to accommodate the university. We cut out all of our singing. We cut out any witnessing in the sense of a person sharing their testimony. We have done some teaching where we've taught from a more objective point of view in the sense that we just approached a certain subject matter from a Christian perspective. But as far as being able to teach the Bible authoritatively, in other words, and say this is truth, this is something a person should consider, something we consider to be truth, well, that definitely is something we are not allowed to do.
If you and I are sitting here and we're talking about whatever it is, I am not going to go up and say, now, pardon me, but are you talking about religious faith?
Sure,
you know.
It's hard to enforce.
So I think there is a measure of practicality. Organized, sponsored, and advertised. Come to this place at this time, and hear or do whatever. You know, that becomes more conspicuous, certainly. And in the case of Cornerstone, for example, there was once it was called to our attention, the Cornerstone, as I recall, never did say, no, what we're doing is not worshiping. They're saying, yeah, we were worshiping, and we have a right to do that.
Bob Bond has been the director of Campus Crusade for Christ at this university for years. We asked him how he views the university's statement that all other religious groups are in full support of their policies.
No, that's not true. Campus Crusade for Christ was a recognized student organization, and we fell under the same situation as the Cornerstone. And also the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship was forced to leave the campus. They were meeting on a monthly basis on having a dinner, and they were forced to leave and go elsewhere because of this ruling. It really came down to a result of our work on getting what was called a Christian Update Forum. And it was during that time when we became very visible on campus, especially in the academic aspects of working with faculty and different peoples like that, that I believe the university really became threatened by the visibility and the effect that we might have on the overall influence of the university community, and so they took actions to shut us down.
If you view the expression of your beliefs as purely a religious thing, I could see why people would say no. But my faith, I like to think of my faith in terms of a worldview, and this worldview touches on psychological issues, emotional issues, sociological issues. It's more than just a religious corner of my life.
I can see the university's viewpoint, which is it's a separation of church and state issue, but at the same time, Cornerstone, I can see their point that it's freedom of speech, freedom of exercise of religion. You know, I've tried to remain objective about it, although I have to confess that I do find some sympathy with Cornerstone's position that if you're at a university, you should be exposed to a whole range of opinions about things in life and in your education, which of necessity you're going to have some kind of religious input if you're going to have that full range.
The university needs to be consistent about allowing ideas on campus. If they're going to allow over 100 other campus organizations present their ideas, why are they not going to allow the ideas of Jesus Christ to be presented on campus?
If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the University of Missouri, the potential of it can close down campus ministries all across the country.
Should groups such as Cornerstone have the freedom to meet on university campuses? And should religious speech be treated any differently than other kinds of speech? The district court sided with the university. The Circuit Court of Appeals said Cornerstone was right. Now it's up to the U.S. Supreme Court to make the final decision. And their interpretation of the First Amendment will have far-reaching implications for college and university campuses across the country.
Agreed to without dissent by the delegates of the states in Congress assembled.
The great number of legal cases over religious issues in our generation would have astounded the men who gathered here in Philadelphia's Independence Hall to draft the Constitution. Remember, they had just escaped from England, where one state church was so tyrannical that it insisted and had the power to enforce that no other religious expression be allowed. Securing freedom of worship in their new world of America was of supreme importance, so they planned with extreme care to limit any federal authority from interfering in their daily lives. Thomas Jefferson once wrote that the invasion of the courts into religious activity would be dangerous. James Madison called government officials who made religious decisions for their citizens tyrants. 4 years after the Constitution was signed, the early leaders of our country set down their concerns in the Bill of Rights with these words: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. To strip public and community life of all vestige of our Christian heritage would have been a shocking and unthinkable act. Men like Benjamin Franklin recognized the hand of God in the creation of America and spoke these words to the early patriots as they prepared to draft the Constitution.
In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need its assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little, partial, local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest.
While the spiritual roots of the country were recognized in the early days of our country, those fundamental values would come under increasing attack. The Supreme Court would fall to the philosophy of relativism, and basic American values would be questioned and challenged. This deception led one Supreme Court justice a century ago to declare that laws are only beliefs that have triumphed. By the turn of this century, Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes had said, "We are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is." And in 1951, Chief Justice Fred Vinson summed up the court's acceptance of relative humanistic thinking when he wrote that there are no absolutes and all concepts are relative. Before 1940, there was little question the United States was one nation under God. The Supreme Court itself had written, "This is a Christian nation, and we are a Christian people." Freedom for all religions to worship God as they chose was clearly understood. But then something began to happen.
1940. The Supreme Court ruled that federal authorities had a right to interfere in local religious practices. 1944. Children in Massachusetts were stopped from passing out religious literature.
And then in 1947, the Supreme Court picked up a figure of speech used by Thomas Jefferson more than a century and a half ago and used it as a basis for deciding constitutional law. That figure of speech was the separation of church and state. Contrary to what most Americans think, that phrase does not come from the Constitution. It was simply lifted out of a personal letter of Mr. Jefferson's. How the Supreme Court interpreted and applied the comment is dramatically different from the author's intent. President Jefferson intended that religious matters be determined at the local level by each community or congregation, never at the national level by federal authority, and he spelled that out in his second inaugural address.
In matters of religion, I have considered that its free exercise is placed by the Constitution independent of the general government. I have, therefore, undertaken on no occasion to prescribe the religious exercises suited to it, but have left them, as the Constitution found them, under the direction and discipline of the church or state authorities.
But the separation of church and state phrase of Jefferson's private correspondence, given the interpretation by and authority of the Supreme Court, rallied forces opposed to religious freedom to press on. The results in the last 3 decades of lawsuits in the highest court of our land have dramatically diluted our country's basic religious freedom.
1948. Voluntary religious training was ruled unconstitutional in public schools.
1961. The right of states to make laws recognizing God in an oath of office was struck down by the High Court.
1962. Prayer was removed from the public schools. 1963. The Bible could no longer be used as an authoritative source.
And in 1970, an acid test of constitutional law was established, which required that any entanglement of America's religious heritage be dissolved from public life. What was once a recognition of God by our forefathers would now become a matter of scorn and ridicule by judicial powers.
April 1979, home Bible studies were outlawed in Los Angeles. Mayor Tom Bradley said such gatherings may violate city zoning ordinances. October 1979, Christian students